After I won that contest, things started to happen to me in at a rather frenetic pace. The first thing that happened to me was I immediately started to attract people that were only, I guess, coming into the picture because I was this freakish kid musician. Some of these people were there because I guess they might have smelled money. Because at that time, it was still quite possible for a freak kid musician to gain some notoriety and possibly make money in the music business. The business was a bit more about unique talent then than it is now. It has nothing to do with talent now. And unfortunately, some of these people that started to come into my life that I kept attracting over and over again were there for things other than money. And going to get into those things as we go forward with this process. But the first person that kind of walked into my life is I used to hang around. Well, first of all, I want to put our location in perspective. When we moved to Kitchener, we all ended up living in this 3-story townhouse, or 2-story, I think. Oh, 3. There was 3 stories. There was a living room, upper level was the dining room, kitchen, and the third floor was the bedrooms. And Mom and Joe and Bob and I all lived in this townhouse. It was a pretty big place, and we were, Joe and Bob were both working, and Mom had her pension and whatnot, so we had enough money to do that. And that particular time at that living there was pretty cool. I remember a couple of blow-ups between especially Mom and Joe getting drunk and getting into fights, and my mother, being drunk and falling down the stairs and breaking all the toes on one of her feet, and then blaming Joe for Joe wasn't even there. But she was like, I think she was running around he was out somewhere, and she just didn't like that. She couldn't find him, and she was calling everybody, and it was ridiculous what she put everybody through. And he gets home, she's on the couch with her foot up on a pillow with all her toes broken, and she gets into it with him because she couldn't find him, and so she was up and down the stairs. Like, it was just such bizarro world logic but that's one of the only times I ever remember really any kind of altercation living at that particular location. It was that place was also the first place I got my first real, like, super cool bicycle that Bob bought me. It was a motocross bike that looked like a motorcycle. It had spring shocks in the back like a motorbike, and hydraulic shocks in the front like a motorbike, and a bike seat and a plastic gas tank. And he bought that bike for me, and that bike became one of my biggest outlets. I loved bicycles, and I ended up being pretty proficient on bicycles and doing crazy BMX stunts. And before any of this was even a thing, we were always around the neighborhood, me and my buddies. I had a bunch of kids I hung around with out there. The Glovers, Drew and Dave, and the Fortes. Sherry Forte was a girl who used to hang around with us all the time. And another fellow that I went and seen years later, John Sutherland, is a great kid. He was the first guy in the neighborhood to have an actual motorbike. He showed up one day with a Honda 50. And we would drive these bikes all out through these abandoned fields and stuff next to these housing complexes. And So I got really good at it. We were in those days, we were literally building ramps and jumps, and I did some crazy, crazy things on a bicycle, and I hurt myself many times, and so did everybody else. But I remember that, and I remember another thing that was going on at that time in my life is I became fixated also on Elvis Presley. Uh, Elvis had died, the year prior, and I still remembered watching Elvis do the live from Hawaii, the Aloha concert, live on satellite broadcast television when I was a kid. I was a baby when he did that in 1973, I think it was, and then of course it was repeated on television, and then the other thing that happened was they put his final concert on television after he died when he was old and fat and sick, and but I loved his. For me, he was the greatest entertainer I'd ever seen. He had so many things that other people didn't have. He had the looks, he had the wardrobe, he had the band and the hype and like the whole his whole thing to me was like the epitome of performance art. And I used to put Elvis records on the turntable in the basement of that place at Chicopee, and I'd find something I could use for a microphone, and I'd go down there and lip sync and body sync his whole concert, pretend and just go through the whole. I knew all his moves, and it was hilarious. And I'm quite sure I'm not the only kid who did this down through the years. I think millions and millions of people probably tried to emulate him in some form or another, and just when they were kids, just because it was so damn cool, and so I remember doing that, and it's also the first place that I ever got completely knee walking drunk. That was really funny. It wasn't long after I got the bike that this beer came out called Bredor Lager, and it was from Cape Breton. It was a Nova Scotian product, and they started carrying it in the LCBO, or the beer store it was called, in Ontario. And the boys were freaking out, and they bought 2 or 3 flats of this stuff, and it was really powerful. It was not 5% alcohol. It was more along the lines of 6.7 or 6.8%. And one day I sneaked down the basement where all this beer is, and I drank about 6 of them. And I was 10, maybe 11 years old. And I decided, drunk out of my mind, I was going to go ride my bike. And so I'd go outside, jump on the bike, and I was pedaling drunkenly all over the place. And then my mother goes down the basement and discovers all these empties. And she's like, oh my God. And so she runs outside looking for me, and I'm way at the top of the road on the sidewalk coming back down towards her. And she knows, because I'm all over the place. And like about 20 feet before I got to her, I just completely wiped out, went over the handlebars, landed on my face. And like she was laughing and mad at the same time, because it must have looked awful funny. And so she took me inside and she said, don't you ever do that again. And alcohol, I had a strange relationship with alcohol in my house my whole life. We were of the mind, and my mother and father were of the mind, that if I wanted to have a little glass of beer, and that be it, there was no harm in that. And my mother used to say, and I think this is true, that a lot of the Europeans, children drink wine at meals sometimes, or beer, a little bit of beer, and like this, there was no huge social taboo. And she would cite that all the time. She said, these people don't turn out to be alcoholics. And, and I don't know, hard to say. I had my problems with alcohol later on in my life, way later. But the drinking 6 of these Bredors was definitely not allowed. So that was one of the funniest that was probably one of the funniest things that happened there. And of course, but by the time she got got me back in the house, I was sick, of course, and I threw up, and I was drunk all day, and the next day I had a hangover, and it was the stupidest thing I ever did. But it was funny, and she never let me live it down. But she never said it in front of anybody because she didn't want anybody to know what happened. She knew that, that wasn't going to be, that would be frowned upon by most of the society. So yeah, and plus, she was probably thinking back to when they were trying to take me away from her. That's all she needs is me showing up outside somewhere drunk off my ass, and there we go again. They're trying to take me away from her. So it was funny, but I learned a lesson. I never drank again until I was well into my, I was well, not really legal to drink, but when I was old enough to not drink like an idiot, I was always taught to drink responsibly, and that's what we did. And although we did have a massive tolerance for liquor, but I drank all my life. I had beer every now and then, and never really touched hard liquor till I was well into my teens, late teens. And but it was something that was always around, and so yeah, so there was that part of it, and then we moved. Not long after we got there, we moved. The reason we moved is the same reason that the Cormiers moved every time they moved, which was Mother. Mother was on the run from herself her entire life, and she couldn't get along with anybody. She'd end up fighting with every single and we were living in places that you couldn't get away from your neighbors. They were attached residences, townhouses, where the neighbor was right through the wall, right on the other side of the living room wall. And she always had, it was just one thing after another, and a lot of it came down to many times, unfortunately, I hate saying this, but it's true, but she was a horrible racist. And she often didn't like people because they were brown. And so it was just sad. And I can't believe, it's hard to believe I didn't turn out to be a complete butthole. Because I know racism is something that's taught. And children see it and see their parents do it and act like it and say words they shouldn't say in private. And they get it in their head that it's okay to do that, and it's all right to look at somebody differently for the color of their skin and all these things. It's a wonder I didn't turn out to be a raging arsehole. And because it would have been real easy to do with her around. She just didn't like anybody who was white. And so it was, we moved because she could, one of the other reasons I think we moved is because Bob and Joe both decided that they were going to move out on their own, which was probably had to do with Mother too, that they were probably getting tired of all her crap. They both had jobs, good jobs, and so they decided they were going to move out. So that left us my mother unable to pay the rent there on her own. So we ended up moving literally just around the block. We went up the street, made a left, and went down halfway down that block to a low rental housing place that was on a street called Holborn. And it was a little tiny 2-story townhouse type thing, and it was very cheap, and like a lot of really weird cases lived in this place. And that's where things started to get complicated with me, because I was getting older. I wasn't having as much trouble in school in Kitchener. They were a lot nicer there. I didn't really have much problem there. There was a few people at school that wanted to kick my ass all the time. One group of them was a set of twins. It was a group of people, two guys. And their name was Hawks, their last name. And Stephen, and I can't remember his brother's name, but they always wanted to kick my ass. They were twins. But some of the girls in the school used to protect me. That was always the way. There was a lot of the girls are the one that stood up for me in school. It would get really weird as time went on. There was one girl, her name was Sue Moffat, and I remember she saved my ass one day when I got locked out of the school with these two twins, and they were going to kick my ass, and she ran from inside and opened the door and pulled me into the school and saved me and locked them out. So other than that, though, there really wasn't. I had no problems there at those schools. They were nice people, and I had tremendously good teachers, like teachers that really cared. I remember one of them. His name was Mr. Black, and he was one of the nicest human beings I ever met in the school system. Just a tremendously loving person, like just great teacher, and so there we were in the low rental housing place, and my buddies, I didn't move away from my buddies. They were just around the corner from me where we used to live, so that was good. So I was maintaining these friendships for the first time in my life, really, where I was, old enough to know and to appreciate it, and I was building these, to me, a long-term relationships with these people. I'd been there for a couple of years, and we hung out all the time. Every summer we were together. And I would end up staying there until I was 12. So it would be 3 years, over 3 years that I was with these people, and they were with me every day. And so as that circle of friends, kind of cemented, started to meet the people that they knew. And that's where I first got into trouble. Someone, and I don't really remember who at this point, but it was one of my friends, took me to see a guy in an apartment, a high-rise apartment building that was just across the road down the street from us, because the guy had this guitar that they wanted me to play. And when I get up there, it turned out to be an Ovation Custom Legend, the same kind of guitar that Glenn Campbell played, and I freaked because I loved those guitars, and I'd never actually been able to even hold one or see one in person. And so I went up there and played this guy's guitar for him, and I ended up going up there quite a bit. And that's how things always started. I would go places because of music, and these bizarre side relationships would start to blossom. Probably a bad word, because none of these things ever turned out very well for me, really. And somehow through that guy, who was a really nice guy, I met another guy in the same building. Came down to see me play one day, and he was an older man, probably at that time in his 50s, maybe 40s, late 40s, 50s. And it turns out that he worked at a television station in Kitchener, where they did this a television show, and it was a talent show for kids, and sort of a comedy show. And I know this is surreal, but it's true. The host of this show, I'm convinced that Matt Groening based Krusty the Clown on this guy. His name was Oopsie Daisy. That was the name of this clown, Oopsie the Clown. And this guy, you just knew by looking at this guy that he was drunk off his ass during the taping of this show. You just knew it. There was no way this guy could be sober and do this show, right? Like it was, and he wasn't very funny. And it was he was Krusty the Clown. He even looked like Krusty the Clown. The same kind of outfit, fit, the the hair sticking off to the side, and he even had the horn, the honky horn, walk, walk, like he'd be walking around with that. And what it was a talent show for children, and he was the host, and he was supposed to be funny, and he really wasn't that funny. And we used to watch the show just because of him, because he was so not funny. He was hilarious. And so this older guy shows up and says, "You should be on the Oopsie Daisy show." And now, mind you, the population of this show was kids who were bad dancers and a lot of baton twirlers, girls doing baton routines. And occasionally there was a young man playing the accordion, or I don't know. It just wasn't that entertaining. The artistic side of it wasn't that entertaining. It was actually quite bad, but it was cute, and it gave kids, I think, I wish there was more shows like that now, because what a magic thing to be taken into a real television studio on a channel that everybody got. It wasn't community access. It was the television station that was syndicated to one of the bigger networks. I think it was CHCH Hamilton. I can't remember if that's true, but it seems like that's where it was happening. And there was another show called Tiny Talent Time, which is the same thing, except it was more serious. The hosts of that show wore suit and tie and dress, and was a man and a woman, and they seemed to get more actually more talented children on that show. But so anyhow, this guy says, I work at the station, I could get you on the show. And I'm sure they were looking for talent, right? Because how many kids can you get to twirl a baton and play an accordion badly, right? So I said, well, we'd have to ask my mother. And so this is what happened. Like, this is the way things used to happen to me. The guy shows up, and he's a heavy drinker. This guy's just absolutely ranks of beer continually. It was a smell that I associated with him that was just pervasive. And apparently, I soon found out that he'd get off of work and he'd buy a 6-pack and he'd drink half of it on the way home, driving home, and drink the other 3 when he got to the house. And so he shows up at our door asking my mother if I can do this clown show. And, my mother wasn't that bad a looking woman. She was a heavy woman. When she was young, she was gorgeous. Like, she was 6 feet tall, long blonde hair. She was a beautiful woman when she was a young woman. And when she got, she was in her, she would have been 55 or so at this point. And she was a good looking woman. She was heavy. She was heavy. She was overweight. She was a large chested woman. She had a huge she had that Germanic huge chest, and she was overweight, but she was still a good looking woman. And this guy met my mother and was starting to kind of sniff around, and this is happening right in front of me at this first meeting, and my mother caught it right away. And one thing I got to say about my mother, I don't know why, I'm not sure why she did it, but after Dad died, she never had another man, ever. Never went on a date, never had another man in the house, never. When he died, that was it. She completely shut herself off from the world. There was no one else for her except Paul, which is either commendable, or maybe she knew she couldn't ever find another man that would put up with her, or maybe she knew she was poisoned for a relationship, so she didn't bother. Or all the kids were gone. She was just trying to raise me. That could have been a thing too. She didn't need a man anymore. She was just going to try to get me up and out of the house, and that'd be it. But either way, here comes this guy. and he's sort of hitting on my mom. And she she almost said no. I could see it coming. She was going to tell him to, to piss off and get lost. But for some reason she said, okay, yeah, if you, my mother didn't drive, she didn't have a license. There was cars in the yard because we had both cars. We had I think Bob was driving the Chrysler at that time. We still had the F-85 Oldsmobile that they had painted canary yellow. It was a beautiful car. It was sitting in the parking lot there. And Joe drove that one from time to time. But my mother didn't drive, and so she did, but she just didn't have a license. And so she said, "Yeah, if you'll take him down there and bring him back, I'm okay with that." And so that's what happened. The guy came. I don't even remember this man's name. It's actually kind of a sin, but he came and took me down there, and I prepared this elaborate. Oh, and the guy in the apartment building was kind enough, God bless his heart. He lent me his ovation for this television appearance, and I was so excited that this was happening. And so we get down to the TV station. I had made this elaborate medley. It started out with Nashtownville, which was a Jerry and Chet tune, and went into Windy and Warm, and then Blowing in the Wind, and then I ended the medley with Classical Gas. And it was popping. It was on fire, and I practiced, and I really took this seriously. I took everything seriously when it came to music. I never went into any situation unless I knew I was ready. I did not like making mistakes and looking foolish because I had severe self-esteem problems as it was, and I didn't want to further push myself down by going out in public and making an ass of myself. So I took this very, very seriously, and I practiced it until I hurt my hands, blistered my fingers, and split my fingers open again, my left-hand fingers. My mother was an odd bird, as you've probably start to realize if you watch any of these programs every week. She was an odd woman. She said horrible things to me all the time, and just horrible things, self-esteem crushing things. And then at other times she was so defensive of me that it was stifling. She would kill somebody over me, but at the same time she'd get me home and be holding a butcher knife, looking at me sideways, telling me, do this or do that, or I'm gonna cut your head off. And she was a violent woman in odd ways and unexpected times. A good example of this strange multiple personality almost she had just before Dad died. I'll give you an example. I had a friend of mine that I had in school, one of the only ones I had. I think I only had two friends down there in London. His name was George Graw, and I just loved that kid. He was my best buddy, and he lived not too far from us, and I used to go over to his house, and we'd hang out in the basement and do, like, everybody had a rec room in those days, right? So he had games down there and whatever. It was a great big house. His father was he worked at something like labor, but it was good money he was making over there. He'd come home and jump in the shower in the basement and get all cleaned up, and we'd go up. Sometimes they'd have me, they'd let me stay for supper or whatever. And so one day I came home from George's house after school. I went there over after school with permission. My mother said I could go. When I got home, she started asking me questions about their house, and I didn't know where any of this was leading. And so I told her, I said, they've got a beautiful house, and they did. They had a beautiful home. And I was bragging about all the stuff that George had in the rec room and all of this stuff. And my mother, instead of just whatever, I don't know why, what her reaction, I don't even know what her reaction should have been. Instead, she looked at me and said, fine, if you like that so much, I'll just send you somewhere else to live. Apparently I'm not good enough. This isn't good enough for you. And I lost it. And Dad was away. He was away working. This is in the middle of the week, so he wasn't home. I'm there by myself, and Joe was working too. And so she allowed me to cry, and like, I'm talking about screaming and crying and, no, Mom, don't send me away, don't send me away. She had asked me, actually, I think the next day was in the morning, she asked me. This went on all day. She let me believe from that morning when she first asked me till I think somebody actually finally came home, maybe Joe came home from work that night. She let me believe that she was going to call the child services in the next day and send me away to live somewhere else. Our place wasn't good enough. And then she at the end of the day, she just looked at me and looked over my head. She had a terrible habit of devaluing you by the way she would look down her nose and just over she wouldn't even look at your face. She'd look over the top of your head like she was ignoring you. And she said, okay, fine, I won't send you away. And this is after hours, until I had literally almost cried myself into seizures on the floor. I was a wreck. And like that kind of, I don't even have a description of the kind of trauma that is for a child who at that time, I think I was about, it would have been, like I said, before Dad passed on. Might have been just after. I was about 9 years old. So now jump ahead. The other side of her, right? Our next door neighbor at Holborn was a woman and her daughter, whose name was Angie, who I hung around with all the time. I went to school with her. I just thought she was cool. She was tall, skinny, willowy blonde girl. And she was funny, and we used to crack jokes, and we were friends. And this woman's mother, there was something really wrong with her, and there was something wrong with everybody in that place, of varying degrees, and that's why they lived there. They were living in low rental because they were having a hard time making it, mostly because of their personal lives. Everybody I ran into there was either an alcoholic or a drug addict or an ex-con. It was ridiculous. It was really weird. It was a completely surreal place to be living as a child. And all these people had kids, and we all hung out together, a bunch of losers together, something out of a Stephen King novel. And so this girl's mother was not right. And I don't know what was wrong with her, not sure. But one day, well into my friendship with her daughter, it was never anything, we never got into any trouble, never caused any trouble for anybody else. All my circle of friends accepted her. I was up the block at the mall, the Stanley Park Mall. You could walk there from where we were, and I'd go up there to the little short stop for my candy and my Cokes and chips and whatever. Mom would give me $1, or whatever. And I was coming out of the mall, and her mother, literally leapt out of the nowhere and grabbed me by the shirt and shoved me up against a brick wall there and started berating me about, your mother's making you crazy, blah, blah, your mother's nuts, and blah, blah. And she was, my mother had never even really met this woman. I don't know where any of this came from. And so she scared the crap out of me. She actually threatened me and threatened my mother, and physically. And I was like, what? I couldn't even get my head around what was going on. And I finally got away. I had to physically get away from her. She was holding me up against this wall. And so I physically got away from her, and I got to my bicycle, and I rode the hell home as fast as I could get there, which it was only about a block and a half. So I was down there in a minute. I went into the house and I was in tears, and mother was like, "What's wrong with you?" And I told her what had happened, and my mother just got that quiet, deadly demeanor. And by this time, this maniac had come down, got home as well. She lived right next door, obviously. And she was stupid enough to come pound on our door. She wanted to confront my mother because she realized at this point that I was in there telling her what she had done. So my mother opened the door, and this woman was much like her daughter. She might have weighed 85 or 90 pounds. She was tall, just skinny woman. Like, when I look back at it, she was probably some kind of an addict. I don't know what her deal was, but she was not well. But she was angry, and we never did figure out why this happened. Honestly, we never knew what made her snap. And because I used to go in their place, and like the lights would always be off, it would all be really dark in there. It was just a weird scene. So she comes up to my mother, and she starts going off on my mother. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and your son is this, and your son is that. And I was standing right behind Mom, and my mother was so large, she blocked out the door. And I could see the woman on the other side pointing and waving her arms. And then I saw a magic thing. I saw my mother's elbow come back. Like, this all is in my mind even to this day in slow motion. I saw that elbow come back, and it seemed to come back forever. And then she punched her. Right square in the middle of the face. She punched that woman so hard that she lifted off the ground about 6 inches and flew back about 3 or 4 feet and landed unconscious on her back on the path to the doorway, the walkway, and just laid there. And I thought, holy Jesus, Mother just killed her. But then my mother stood there for a minute and just said nothing, dead silent, and watched her for a few minutes. And then she started to kind of twitch and move around. And my mother turned around, closed the door, the screen door, closed the inside door and locked it, turned around to me and said, "Be the last time she ever touches you." And I thought for sure that we're all going to go to jail. But no, she eventually picked herself up off the walkway and crawled into her house, and we never saw her again, ever. That was the last time we ever saw that woman. They were still living there, but my mother scared the living bejesus out of her. She really thought she was going to come down there and have whatever kind of a mental break she was having. And my mother, because she had laid her hands on me, dropped her. Like, it was hilarious. I know it's horrible, but I laugh every time I think about it because there's 2 things going through my mind. My mother was very abusive to me sometimes, not all the time, but a lot of times. And then at the same time, this juxtaposition of her, somebody else touched her boy and said mean and made him cry. Well, you're going to die for that. Nobody's going to do that to my boy but me. That was that was the thing in my head, and the way it all looked, it was just like something out of a cartoon. Or a movie. It was like a really well-planned stunt. And I never forgot that. And that was just one of the things that happened at that address with my mother. And it terrifies me to think about what would have happened if my mother had been drunk that day. It might have been a lot worse. My mother was really dangerous when she was drinking. But she was dead sober this day. She was in the kitchen cooking supper when this all happened, right? And So that gives you a picture of how confused I was really when this guy came down and asked to take me away by myself. I was going off with a stranger to go do a television show, and she said, yes, you can take him. And to kind of close that chapter without saying too much more about it, the guy, he went, I did the show, and the guy tried to sort of, as always happened to me, tried to remain in my life, and he continued to try to play for Mom, and she shut him down without even really saying anything. And then I felt at a certain point, he kept wanting me to be alone with him, at his apartment or in different situations. And my mother was paranoid, but sad thing is, a lot of her paranoia was based on truth and the way the world is. And she always warned me, the whole stranger danger thing. And there's a lot of sick people out there, and you got to know what you're doing. Don't trust anybody that way. And sure enough, I started to get some really bad vibes from this guy. When he couldn't get after Mom, I started to feel real uncomfortable around him. And at a certain point, I just stopped going there, and I started to avoid him, and he dissolved into the background. But it was my first experience, and sadly the first of many, of people that came into my life that may have been, well, that guy I don't know for certain fact, but it certainly looked to me like there was some predation going on there. And later on in life, it was full-blown with other people that came into the situation, my life's situation. But on the bright side of that, I ended up in front of those television cameras with Oopsie the Clown. Poor old Oopsie. And he came in and met all the kids, and he smelled like Jack Daniels. It was hilarious. He was out back of the television station, smoking a cigarette, and I think he was pulling off a flask. He had alcohol with him, and it was really surreal and funny. And he was a nice guy, but it was very surreal that I'm there with this clown, who I would later come to, I really believe they took Krusty from him, and there was a rehearsal in the afternoon, and then the show after supper, and I remember playing this medley for the cameraman to practice his shots with, and the guy stepped out from behind the camera and looked at me and said, "Man, you're a great guitar player." And he started asking me about the guitar, and I said, "Well, it's not mine, it's an Ovation." And it was gorgeous. It was full of abalone. It was I believe it was a tobacco sunburst color, beautiful guitar. And I said, "This is not mine, but I love this thing. This is a beautiful guitar." And the guy said, "Well," he said, it needs to be for the player, or something to that effect. He took a moment to show his appreciation for what I was doing in a job that I'm quite sure he never really had occasion to do very often, because they really didn't have, pro-level kids on there. It was an odd thing to have on. They did have them. They existed. There was young violinists and accordionists and piano players and dancers and things that were incredible for their age, right? But this cameraman, I looked up at him and I could just see the kind of the shock on his face. And he was so into what I was doing, and he filmed me differently than he filmed other acts. He took a lot of time and did cool close-ups, and the camera moved, and it was just really cool. And he made me feel good about myself, and that was sort of the beginning of my love affair with cameras. I was never afraid to be on camera after that. It just didn't fizz me. I liked it. I liked the idea of being recorded visually. It was so cool. Like, okay, if I do this, they see that. If I do that, they see that. Like, whatever you did, it's immortalized on film or videotape, right? And I just loved it. And that first experience, as you know, as a performer too, to be amongst kids really my own age and being so far above what they were doing, kind of opened my eyes as well. That I was alone in a lot of ways, and that part of it kind of maybe disappointed me a little. I was alone. There was no. I couldn't look at any other child that was on that episode of that show and relate to them musically, because they weren't doing anything like what I was doing, and I think it may have reinforced my self-isolation as I continued to grow as a player. I almost purposely stayed away from other players because I didn't want to make them feel bad, which happened all the time as well. And it's a complex set of emotions there. I wanted to be around other players because I wanted to learn and watch, but at the same time, a lot of the times when I was a kid, as soon as I played one number on the guitar or whatever, everybody in the room would stop playing, and that sucked to me. I didn't want that. That's not what I was looking for. And but I'll never forget Oopsie the Clown. Take 217. Oh, I didn't think this through. Here we go. almost made it. But I think that's as good as I can do it 40 years later. Mason Williams was the man. Thanks, Mason.